Hello. Thank you to the two of you for being here. Thank you, everybody else out there, for talking about how we are single-handedly saving the world. I think it's safe to say. Maybe you are, because I don't really do the science. I just report on it. But we're talking about alternative proteins, and these come in a number of forms. Probably familiar with the Impossible Burger, which is fake beef. But you folks are working on two very distinct technologies that come with their own challenges. And instead of me butchering, no pun intended, what you do, if you could just introduce yourselves and talk about your companies.
Great, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie Risheni. I'm the founder and CEO of Nobel Foods. At Nobel, we make dairy, cheese, and other dairy products without using any animals in the process. As some of you might or might not know, but our food system is actually a huge contributor to greenhouse gases and to the climate crisis we're in. So our mission is to have a positive impact on that.
Justin. And hey everyone, I'm Justin Kolbeck from Wildtype. We make cell-cultivated salmon. And if you have no idea what that means, we basically brew or ferment real salmon cells, put them on a plant-based backbone to create highly structured whole cuts of the seafood that we love. And we're focused on sushi-grade salmon as our first product. We're based in San Francisco.
So the food system is unfortunately highly problematic when it comes to emissions. Among other things, it uses a lot of land, particularly for cows to have them out at pasture. Cows burp a lot. That's a huge source of carbon. Fun fact, it's not the farts, it's the burps from cows that we have to worry about. Now you all know. So if we could talk about, first of all, maybe to lay some groundwork, where are those emissions coming from beyond the cows, but also when we're talking about fish, what are the problematic points of obviously overfishing the seas and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I'll start, and then I'll let Justin talk about the sea. So for kind of where we are with our food system is the fundamental issue when you think about it is that we grow about 60, 70 billion animals each year, so we can feed 7.8 billion people. And it's not just growing the animals, but it's actually growing the land, so growing crops to feed the animals and then grow them over time so we can then milk them or harvest them for meat. So if you look at the whole supply chain, there's multiple places where you have emissions, all the way from cultivating, growing the plants that go into feeding the animal, and then the animal throughout its lifetime. With cows and ruminants in general, it's from their digestion system. So yes, the burping is a big problem. But I also would say that kind of the climate crisis is not just greenhouse gas emissions. There's actually so many other embedded issues in there that get less attention, but loss of biodiversity, for example, is one of them, and agriculture is one of the leading causes of the loss of biodiversity. So we're basically kind of removing ecosystems to use that land to grow crops to feed cows so we can feed ourselves, right? So kind of that whole system is fundamentally prone for innovation. And then just to tie it back to the work we do at Nobel, we actually have plants that we grow that produce the same proteins that animals do. So with our technology, what we do is we make dairy proteins, the exact same proteins that animals make, but we make them from plants. So instead of growing plants, feeding them to cows, and then feeding people, you just grow plants and make dairy and other products to feed people directly.
Did you ever think you spent so much time talking about burps on the stage?
Not really, no.
So I don't know if fish burp, but from a biodiversity perspective, it's a very similar story to what you were talking about with cattle. So by some estimates, we'll have basically very little fish, maybe more plastic in the oceans than fish by the middle part of this century, by 2050, if we're not careful. A lot of our favorite seafood species might be extinct by that same year, including salmon. And so what we're facing down is a gigantic climate crisis where we'll have an ocean full of jellyfish, which I don't think anybody wants. Some of you may know that our oceans are our largest carbon sink for our planet, helps our planet stay cool. And if we remove all of the animals and biodiversity from that, we're not sure if Earth's refrigerator will continue to function. And so that's one way that you can get fish, which is wild catch. And fish populations are only going one direction, which is down and to the right, unfortunately. But you can also farm fish. The trouble with farming fish, however, is that still a very large share of fish feed comes from wild catch. So sardines and anchovies ground up and fed to bigger fish like tuna and salmon. The coastline areas where you can farm fish continue to shrink or at least migrate due to climate change. And so what we're left with is declining wild fish stocks and super problematic fishing farming practices. So supplies are shrinking, demand is growing really fast for seafood, and unsurprisingly, we're seeing super rapid price increases in most of the seafood that we eat, including salmon.
I think we're at this interesting but also troubling time in human history where we have a lot of growth in the population of humans, and we need to feed all those people with the same amount of land, the same amount of ocean that we've always had, and we need to find these new technologies to get those people fed. And what I think is really interesting about both of your companies is that you're iterating, right? Like a burger from a cow is a burger from a cow, but what you folks can do with your own different segments of the market is build kind of like software or hardware, different iterations of your products to make it better and better and better. And I was wondering if you could talk about, over the years as you've developed your products, how you've actually overcome some of those challenges, like building new software or hardware.
So you said something really interesting. It's like the cow is the cow, and the cow is not getting better, right? And I think that once you look at the food system and you kind of say, okay, if I had to rebuild this, if I had to start from scratch, what would I do? It really opens up the possibilities for so many things. The reality is that innovation in food has barely started. Like, we're just kicking off and we're just scratching the surface of what we can do. I think that the interesting piece is not just competing with the cow per se, but how do you make products that are not just as good, but also better, right? And as you mentioned, Matt, it's an iterative process, right? Like both Justin's company and ours, we're developing technology from the ground up. There's a lot of learning and there's a lot of iteration. And because we start from ground zero, we get to put the things that we like in the product. We get to take out the things that we don't like, right? And over time, it's only going to get better.
Yeah, and I can speak firsthand experience. I've had Maggie's products over the years. She and I have known each other for like 6 years now. And they have gotten a lot better, as have ours. Like, I look back at some of our press from like the 2019 era and cringe. We were so proud of those products because nobody had ever grown like a little fillet of salmon like that before, as we did. But now, 3 years later, I mean, it's much, much better. And so on one hand, like Maggie said, we can continue to improve where an animal is static. And at least in our case, we can make significant improvements on seafood, right? So we don't have mercury or microplastics or antibiotics or parasites that you have to freeze before you can eat your sushi. We've made, in a lot of ways, a superior product. Obviously, the animal is this miraculous thing, right? That creates highly nutritious, beautiful food that we eat, and getting cells to replicate all of that complexity is terrifyingly difficult, I would say. But over time, you do make a lot of progress, and I get a lot of hope when I look back on what those very early prototypes were that even the press didn't get to see, that just Ari and I made. And it gets me really excited about what's going to come 5 or 10 or 15 years, not just from what we're doing or what Maggie's doing, but the 15 budding entrepreneurs in this audience that haven't even started their companies yet, right? Gives me a huge amount of hope.
Yeah, and I don't want to call nature inefficient by any means. Like, all organisms are perfectly efficient in their own way, but the way that we use livestock in particular is totally inefficient. We feed them and we give them water to grow big cows, and then we use the meat and maybe some other things, but you're sustaining a life and then ending that life in what you can argue is a very inefficient way. And I think that's where culture meat is really interesting is that you take out all that stuff, all the bone. If you're working with fish, take out all their bones, and you are building meat in a lab. And I find that very fascinating as this, again, I don't want to call nature inefficient, but the way that we use it in our food system is inefficient, especially when it comes to dairy products. Like, we are sustaining those lives with a lot of climate consequences in particular.
Yeah, and I would say nature is inefficient for feeding 7.8 billion people, right? Like, there's just too many people. There's not enough resources. I think the challenge is that we act as if we have infinite resources, but we live on a finite planet, right? So that's where the beauty of innovation comes in, is like, with all the tools that we have, I mean, really, we are in, and I can't emphasize, I know this is a tech conference and we're talking about climate, but I can't emphasize this enough, that like the climate crisis we're in is literally the most existential crisis we're facing on this planet. So that's the scary part. The great part is that we have all the tools, we have all the minds, we have the innovations we need to develop to get ourselves out of this. So I do believe that we can work with nature, not against it, with nature. Like, we grow plants, right? Like, our plants grow in soil, they're grown by farmers. We still take advantage of natural systems, but we're doing it in a way that's more aligned with the number of people on the planet and what we need to do in order to stay within planetary boundaries.
Yeah, I love what you said about working with nature. Our cells, it's amazing. They like know what to do. If you like put them on the right surface, they get the signals to become muscle, and they'll like stretch out, and they'll get more than one nucleus. It's programmed into life, so it's like harnessing it in a slightly different way, in a different medium, I think gives us a huge amount of opportunities. Not to make the animal more efficient per se, but maybe more efficient for the end use, which is food for humans.
I think it's important to put this all in perspective as technological innovation, in that in the developing world, livestock in particular isn't necessarily just food. They're working animals, they're used as currency, that sort of thing. So this isn't about, okay, let's develop these technologies, spread them all the way across the planet. Everybody's going to be eating cultured meat at some point, which misses the mark here for billions of people on this planet. And I was wondering if we could talk about the way that market might shape up. So obviously, neither of you can corner the entire market on alternative proteins. They're very different. But maybe how might different technologies that you're working on kind of all coalesce into certain markets, shifting more and more to these alternative proteins from these rather inefficient systems that we have now?
So obviously, 1-2 companies are not going to change the food system. Like, if you just look at meat, for example, it's $1 trillion market. If you look at dairy, it's also close to $1 trillion market. These are humongous markets, and if we're going to change them, we need kind of like an army of people and innovations. So I really believe that we're just getting started. We're really early in that kind of transformation of our food system. And that we do need to collaborate, to partner, to work with other people. And we need a lot more technologies, whether it's cultivating cells, whether it is using fermentation, so genetically engineering yeast, or whether it's growing proteins in plants, or just using existing plant ingredients, right? There's room for all these technologies to coexist. We're so early, and it's such a huge market that there's room for so much more innovation.
I have this number in my mind, 40 million tons. That's how much more seafood we'll need by 2030 to meet existing demand. And where is that going to come from? We can't fish anymore, right? Farms, as I mentioned, are constrained. And so I think about where existing industries might work with ours efficiently. And I'll give you an example. So a lot of the salmon that we grow in North America is shipped on a boat to China to be processed and then shipped back. I'm sorry, but like that is not efficient, right? So maybe where wild fish are caught is where they should be consumed. And technologies like Maggie's and ours could potentially be inland, or places where we don't have to worry about as many food miles and crazy expensive contortions of logistics to try to get somebody in Idaho, a piece of bluefin tuna that was caught in Malta and then processed somewhere else, right? I think that's probably where we'll end up, is a much more sensible distribution based on where food can be supplied in the future, which will be now decoupled from where conventional centers of production have typically been.
I have to ask about this because it's totally fascinating. There's this idea in robotics, the uncanny valley, where you get a humanoid robot that looks a lot like a human, but not quite, and it freaks us out, which is a fun concept. We're already getting to that point, and I've heard people talk about this potentially happening in food as well. So the Impossible Burger, for example, is a really good approximation of a real hamburger. Is that something you actually have to contend with? Like, are consumers gonna freak out about your foods being almost there, but not quite? Or does that not matter? For me personally, Impossible Burger isn't perfect, but I only buy that now. It's just what I do.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So if in general, if you look at why people make food choices, the leading factors are usually taste, price, and convenience. For the majority of the population, those are the three leading factors. So environmental issues, animal welfare, health, they tend to not be the leading decision factors for the majority of the population. So with that in mind, if you just use that as a framework, if we can make products that compete on taste, price, and that are easy to find, then you're automatically in a strong position, right? And if you can make them even better over time, meaning cheaper or taste better, then you're really in a situation where using just like the economic forces and how people make decisions, you're really in a strong position to change a little bit of the purchase behavior. I do think, though, that it's going to take time, meaning, like you said, Matt, like the Impossible Burger is great, but a lot of people don't think it's exactly like beef, right? So part of it is having this openness to understanding that our food system is a huge source of problems for the climate, and that we're going to have to make choices that contribute to helping these issues. They might not be 100% there today, but over time, I'm very hopeful with all the technologies that we're developing that we're going to get not just at the same level, but eventually even better than the animal products that are out there. Again, like the other piece is that I'm very hopeful that there is a generation that actually cares about climate and is a lot more inclined to try products and be champions for kind of what the future of food looks like. But it's going to be a gradual process. It's not going to happen overnight.
Do you think we need to tell consumers about some of these differences, though? Or should we just call it milk? I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on that, in your case.
I mean, we make cheese, right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't have an animal in the process, but it's cheese. And I think part of it is over time redefining what meat and cheese and fish mean. Like right now, for the majority of the people, that means cheese means milking a cow, taking the milk, and then making cheese out of it. Or fish means getting on a boat and fishing. So I think that it's going to take a generational shift, but we need to, over time, redefine what these terms mean.
I mean, you have to do it for food safety too, right? Like if it's made of fish, you need to say that it's made of fish, shellfish in particular for allergies and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, interestingly, that came up in some conversations with FDA because they asked us, like, what should we call, I think it was called animal proteins made with cultured animal cells was like their placeholder
rolls
term.
Off the tongue, yeah.
Yes, it does. And that was a point that we made. We're like, look, this has, like, we included this in this public response to FDA. Like, here's the DNA mapping of our cells. It matches exactly with what's on FDA's website for DNA mapping of coho salmon. If we don't have it on there, people who don't want to eat fish are going to be in trouble, right? Yet, our product is made in a very different way and has different pros and cons, let's say, than conventional seafood. So I think, on one hand, I agree. I think, it's just salmon made in a different way. But on the other hand, there are some differences that we need to somehow communicate to consumers to get them, like, really excited about what we're doing. but also in the spirit of transparency, sharing a little bit about how this was made. We don't want people to be confused, right? Our company's name is Wildtype. I don't want them to think this is like wild caught, right? Because they'll be disappointed. And so I think there's still a lot of thought and work that needs to go into how we communicate and message that.
I mean, is there also pushback from consumers on the notion of this being a highly processed food? Like the concern over processed foods is unscientific. Like there's no reason that a processed food is inherently bad for you. It's the ingredients within that processed food that you need to worry about. Like bread is a processed food, technically. But do you foresee issues going to market where you have people saying, well, how does it get much more processed than what you're doing here?
Well, I would say all cheese is processed. You don't pick up cheese from trees, right? So to me, what's interesting is you have to look at what you're comparing it to, right? So, and how it's being used. Like if your goal is to optimize for health, then I would say you should go eat a quinoa bowl or a kale salad. Don't eat a cheese pizza. Like we're making cheese. We want to be on top of pizza. We want to be on top of a burger. That's our goal. So really, like if you compare what we're doing and what it's meant to do and how it's meant to be consumed, we're not selling, kale salads. So I think that as well, like the number of ingredients on a list does not necessarily mean it's bad or good for you. So the word processed, I think it's very tricky because it's being used a lot and it doesn't have like a clear definition, but it also doesn't mean good or bad. Like bread is processed, apple pie is processed. A lot of things we eat every day are processed. And I would say cheese is made from a process where you take milk and you culture it and you transform it into cheese. So we just need to be cognizant of how our food system is built right now and how we're getting it. And when you have that in mind, right, like to make milk, most people don't realize that cows are not just there making milk. you have to impregnate them and then they make milk and you have to keep doing that over and over. So that is the process of making milk, and then there's another process to get to cheese.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add is, we have this pristine gold standard in salmon, which is high in protein, low in saturated fat, high on omega-3s. And to me, that's the gold standard we need to hit, which is nutritional comparability, right? And Maggie, I mean, you're making like delicious fatty cheese. You have
it's still high in protein, but it's also high in fat.
Right, yeah, exactly. So I think depending on what you're making, you've got a different call to action. For us, is to make a super nutritious, lean protein, right? That is still tasty. And that's where a lot of our iteration has been over the years, is getting closer and closer to that gold standard.
We just have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to ask you to predict the future, naturally. In 10 years, where do you see the food system? Have we made progress on cutting emissions, beyond your own products? Where do we stand?
What I see or what I hope, because those are very different.
Let's be realistic. What you
what
see?
Do I see? I think that there are going to be a lot of new products entering the market in every category. I think there's going to be room for a lot of new ways to make food. I think the next decade is going to be instrumental to just getting these new products and reshaping the way people think. So I think just like the Impossible Burger did that for the burger in 2016, I think we're going to see that across different categories. The new technologies that are being developed, I think, have not hit the market. Like if you think of cultivated meat or salmon, that is not on the market. And that's a very different experience from a product perspective than just putting plants together. Our products are not on the market either, and that's literally making the exact same molecules that are in dairy. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for new products to hit the market, and that's going to take up a larger percentage of where the market stands today. Justin?
I mean, +1 to everything Maggie said, as usual. I guess I would just add, I think in the way that Tesla energized this bigger shift to a cleaner energy economy, I think we can play a similar role by getting the conventional players to be a little bit more thoughtful about carbon emissions, even in seafood, which is not always thought about. And I know because I'm on all these dorky seafood mailing lists, that all the big seafood players are talking about things like sustainability, biodiversity, and lowering carbon footprints. And I think that'll only continue. So we've got this great convergence of new tech, like Maggie was saying, as well as really positive momentum from the conventional players that I think will make a big difference in 10 years. I'm very hopeful.
That's a great way to end it on a hopeful note that I'm not used to as a journalist. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Thank you for everybody for being here. We appreciate it.
Thanks.